He can still hear the surf of Juno Beach in his nightmares. It is not the crashing roar we are used to in movies, but a dull, endless pounding that seeps into the bones. The morning of June 6, 1944, a young Canadian signals engineer, let us call him David, standing ankle-deep in cold Channel water, fumbled with a waterproof satchel pressed against his chest, his fingers numb, his mind racing. Around him, men from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division shouted, slipped, fell. The air smelled of cordite, diesel, and fear. And somewhere up ahead, beyond the obstacles and the mines, German artillery waited, convinced that any Canadian attempt to break through would stall, bleed, and die on this beach. They had no idea that before this day was over, Canada would leave 340 men killed and 574 wounded on Juno, and still punch a hole so deep in the Atlantic wall that German commanders would stare at their maps in disbelief. They had not expected the flawed, uncertain network of Canadian radios, field telephones, improvised wiring, and human determination to succeed where so many simulations and staff studies had predicted failure. They had not anticipated that an engineer like David, wrestling with doubt and grief, could help turn a fragile web of technology into a living, beating nervous system for an army pushing inland under fire. In 1944, German intelligence rated Canadian troops as solid but not exceptional, their technology as competent but hardly revolutionary. And yet by nightfall on D-Day, Canadian units at Juno would penetrate farther inland than any other Allied beach, despite sustaining some of the heaviest early losses. How does that happen? How do imperfect tools, rush designs, and human improvisation overcome well-prepared defenses and ruthless enemy doctrine? And what does it do to the hearts and minds of the men carrying those tools when every crackle of a headset might decide who lives and who never leaves the sand? To understand why German commanders never saw Juno coming in the way it actually unfolded, we need to step back to the 1930s, long before Canadian boots touched French sand. The world was still staggering from the Great Depression. In Germany, unemployment, humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles, and a growing culture of resentment created fertile ground for Nazism. As Hitler rearmed, he also cultivated a myth that war could be fought not only with brute force, but with cutting-edge technology and iron discipline. Radios in German tanks, dive bombers with sirens designed to terrorize, and tightly coordinated combined arms tactics fed the legend of Blitzkrieg. In Canada, the story looked very different. The country was vast, underpopulated, and cautious. Its armed forces were small and underfunded. Yet this very modesty produced something unusual, a culture where ingenuity, make-do solutions, and quiet professionalism started to matter more than flashy doctrine. In workshops and labs across Canada and Britain, civilian engineers, many of them barely out of university, wrestled with pulse frequencies, vacuum tubes, antennas, and encryption tables. They were not dreaming of glory. Many of them, like our fictional engineer David, had grown up in families that still remembered the butchery of the First World War. Their nightmares were not of heroic last stands, but of slaughter by miscommunication, artillery dropping short on friendly troops, battalions left unsupported because a cable was cut or a message delayed. David's path into war did not begin with a rifle. It began with a childhood love of tinkering. He grew up in Ontario, fascinated by the way radios could pluck invisible voices out of the air. He built crystal sets from scrap parts, strung wire antennas between trees, and listened to distant broadcasts bouncing in from across the Atlantic. His father, a veteran of the trenches, rarely spoke of battles, but he sometimes mentioned how orders got lost in the mud and chaos, how a runner could be shot, how a telephone line could be severed by a single shell splinter, and then a company would vanish into silence. For David, technology was not just exciting, it felt like a moral responsibility. If better communication could save lives, then wires and valves were no longer abstract. They were lifelines. When the war began in 1939 and Canada declared war alongside Britain, David enlisted not in the infantry, but in the Signals Corps. He found himself in a world where young men and women in uniform hunched over oscilloscopes, soldering irons, and codebooks. Many of his colleagues were first or second generation immigrants. children of families from Britain, France, Ukraine, and beyond. In their shared workbench conversations, you could hear the cultural anxieties of the 1930s, fear of totalitarianism, mistrust of propaganda, and questions about whether technology would free humanity or enslave it. Early on, what they built did not always work. Field trials in the damp English countryside often turned into long, demoralizing slogs. Sets that worked in the lab would glitch in the fog, batteries died faster than expected, and rain seeped into supposedly waterproof housings. More than once, David watched officers fume as messages failed to get through or as interference garbled crucial coordinates. During one test exercise, a simulated artillery barrage landed off-target in the scenario because of a timing error in transmissions. The shells were fictional, but the lesson was real. If this happened in France, men would die. A British colonel, exasperated, supposedly snapped, "Your machines had better learn to keep time, gentlemen, or the dead will have a word with you." That line stayed with the engineers. The problem was not just technical, it was psychological. Every failure chipped away at their confidence. Under the surface, ethical tension simmered. Were they making war more efficient and therefore more deadly? Some argued that the more precise the coordination, the more surgical the violence could become, potentially shortening the war and sparing civilians. Others worried that by perfecting communication, they were feeding the machinery of destruction. In letters home, some engineers confessed their doubts, admitting that it felt eerie to celebrate a successful test when the very success was measured in how accurately they could guide hypothetical fire onto a grid square filled with imaginary human beings. Yet the reality of Nazi occupation, reports of persecution, and the bombing of cities eroded pacifist instincts. Many came to see their work as a grim necessity. If the war had to be fought, then it had to be fought intelligently, with every tool available to reduce unnecessary sacrifice on their own side. By the early 1940s, Canada's technological contribution to the Allied war effort was growing. Canadian factories turned out radios, vehicles, and small arms, while Canadian scientists and engineers fed into joint Allied projects in cryptography, radar, and communications. There was an odd cultural duality at work. At home, Canadian society prized modesty and understatement. On the battlefield, that translated into a kind of quiet, determined professionalism. They did not advertise themselves as elite storm troops. But by the time planning began for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the Canadian 3rd Division and its supporting units had become experienced, heavily trained, and closely integrated with British and other Allied forces. In map rooms and on airfields, plans were drawn up for code names, call signs, frequencies, and fallback procedures. The invasion would require an unprecedented choreography of ships, planes, tanks, and infantry. For the Canadians on Juno Beach, that meant that their radios and signal lines would become arteries of this vast organism. Yet the system had cracks. Some of the equipment assigned to Canadian units was older or considered second line compared to the cutting-edge gear earmarked for certain elite formations. Wartime production pressures meant trade-offs: robustness versus portability, range versus reliability. Engineers like David often stared at a radio set and saw not just its specifications, but its vulnerabilities. Would the casing hold up under saltwater spray? Would the antenna be visible to snipers? Could an overworked operator in the noise of battle distinguish a faint signal from random static? These questions were not academic. They were matters of life and death. Critics within the military hierarchy occasionally dismissed the emphasis on fine-tuning communications as overthinking. At the end of the day, it still comes down to men with rifles, one skeptical officer reportedly said, but others, especially those who had watched campaigns in North Africa and Italy, knew better. Units that lost communication often froze or splintered. Rumor and fear filled the silence, and even well-trained soldiers could drift into panic when cut off. The human mind craves connection. In war, that connection might be a scratchy voice on a headset saying, "You're not alone. We hear you." As 1943 turned into 1944, the stakes for getting it right soared. The Allies knew they would get only one real chance at a cross-channel invasion. German defenses along the coast of France, concrete bunkers, minefields, artillery, were formidable, but Hitler also believed he could crush any beachhead if he reacted quickly with armored counterattacks. In this equation, Canadian forces on Juno were a crucial piece, assigned not just to seize a narrow strip of sand, but to push inland rapidly toward key objectives, linking up with British forces and blunting German moves. That required tight coordination under fire. It also required something harder to measure: psychological resilience. Communications technology would not just move orders, it would carry encouragement, confirm rumors, and sustain morale. For soldiers who had trained for years for this one day, the thought of being left in silence, unable to call for fire or report their progress, was terrifying. The cultural backdrop also mattered. Canadian troops and their support units were not fighting for conquest but for liberation. Many had grown up seeing Britain as the old country, and France as a symbol of culture, art, and democracy. Reports of Nazi brutality in occupied Europe added an emotional charge. They were not just crossing water, they were crossing into a moral landscape where their actions would decide the fate of families they had never met. This sense of purpose shaped their view of technology. Radios and signal flares were not cold tools. They were bridges to distant allies, to command centers that could send support, and to a future in which Europe might be free again. When we talk about invasion technology, we often imagine tanks, landing craft, or naval guns. But for the men on Juno, the invisible infrastructure of communication often made the difference between chaos and cohesion. The Allies had learned bitter lessons from earlier amphibious operations like Dieppe, where miscommunication and overconfidence had contributed to catastrophic losses for Canadian forces. Those scars lingered. Many of the officers and NCOs preparing for Juno remembered Dieppe personally, or knew men who had died there. The memory colored every rehearsal, every briefing on signal protocols. They did not just want better machines, they wanted a different outcome, a different story written on the beach. As the final plans for D-Day solidified, engineers like David felt the pressure like a physical weight. They sat in huts under blackout curtains, poring over wiring diagrams and test reports deep into the night. Some of them developed nervous tics, insomnia, or migraines. They worried not only about enemy fire, but about the possibility that, under stress, human operators would make mistakes, flipping the wrong switch, misreading a code, panicking when static blared unexpectedly. So training intensified. Soldiers practiced sending and receiving under simulated bombardments, while instructors shouted and explosions played on loudspeakers. The aim was not only technical proficiency, but inoculation against fear. If the brain could learn to function amid chaos, then the wires and circuits might fulfill their potential as extensions of the human nervous system, rather than fragile prosthetics failing under the first real blow. On the other side of the channel, German commanders assessed the Allied threat through their own technological and cultural lenses. Many respected Canadian soldiers, but did not see them as the primary spearhead. German coastal defenders expected the main thrust at other sectors, and their assumptions about Allied coordination were shaped by earlier encounters. They knew the Allies had strong radios and air power, but they also trusted in their own defensive doctrine, which emphasized local initiative and hardened positions. Some German officers believed that once the initial shock of the landings passed, the Allies would bog down, their units shattered by artillery and counterattacks before they could organize themselves inland. What they underestimated was how quickly Canadian formations, supported by a flexible, if imperfect, communications network, could recover from initial losses and keep pushing. Years later, some German veterans would express surprise at how professional and relentless the Canadian advance on Juno felt, despite the heavy early casualties. The enemy, they realized too late, had woven human resilience and technology into something more formidable than the sum of its parts. June 6, 1944, dawned with leaden skies and rough seas. In the cramped hold of a landing craft bouncing toward Juno Beach, David checked his equipment for the 100th time. Around him, infantrymen vomited into their helmets, muttered prayers, or forced small jokes through clenched teeth. The air tasted of metal and fear. David's own hands trembled as he double-checked the seals on his radio gear. It was supposedly waterproof, but he had watched similar sets fail in calmer seas during trials. A single wave breaking the wrong way could drown the circuits that hundreds of men depended on. As the ramp dropped and machine gun fire stitched the water, David hit the surf, cold rising to his waist, then his chest. For a heart-stopping moment he stumbled, expecting to feel the satchel rip from his hands. Somehow, he held on. In that instant, technology did not feel like an abstract marvel of modern warfare. It felt like a living, terrified extension of his body. The first minutes on Juno were a nightmare. German strongpoints, bristling with machine guns and artillery, poured fire onto the beach. Many assault teams were cut down before they could even clear the waterline. Canadian casualties mounted rapidly. Men fell in clusters near the obstacles, their equipment scattered in the surf. For engineers and signalers, every instinct screamed to stop and help the wounded. Yet their orders demanded that they move, find cover, and get their communications established. It was a brutal psychological test. To run past a wounded friend in order to plug in a line or raise an antenna required suppressing the most human urges in favor of a deeply internalized understanding. If the net did not come alive, more men would die, and the beach might become a graveyard of an entire brigade. Under fire, the technical compromises of the previous years revealed themselves. Some radios failed outright after being submerged too deeply. Others crackled with interference amidst the electromagnetic chaos of dozens of sets coming online at once. Field telephones needed lines strung across open ground, where every meter exposed the linemen to sniper and artillery fire. There were moments where David felt the entire plan unraveling, where the silence in his headset felt like a confirmation of his darkest nightmares. A German shell slammed into a nearby position, showering him with sand and fragments. For a few seconds he could not hear anything but the ringing in his ears. He stared at his steadily blinking indicator light, unsure if it meant alive or merely dying slowly. Yet amid this chaos, human adaptability began to compensate for technical flaws. Some signalers used salvaged parts from damaged sets to jury-rig functioning units. Others improvised antennas out of rifle rods, bayonets, or scrap wire, searching for that sweet spot where a faint Allied call sign could cut through the static. Infantrymen, trained in basic signal procedures, carried messages between positions when electronic means were temporarily down. The communications net did not come online in one smooth textbook moment. It flickered, staggered, and then gradually coalesced into a patchwork that, while far from perfect, was good enough to keep the assault moving. The stakes were not merely tactical, they were psychological. When the first coherent message from an inland Canadian unit reached a command ship offshore, confirming that despite fierce resistance and mounting casualties, some companies had broken through the immediate defenses and were pushing inland, it sent a jolt of hope rippling through the chain of command. In reverse, when frontline officers realized they could still reach artillery support, naval gunfire, and higher headquarters, it countered the isolation and terror of combat. A young platoon leader pinned down near a seawall might hear a calm, practiced voice in his ear. "We read you. Fire mission on your coordinates in 30 seconds. Hold." That tiny thread of connection could mean the difference between holding position and a panicked, disorganized retreat. German defenders, for their part, were not blind to the unfolding situation. Many fought with grim determination. But their own communication systems were under extreme strain. Allied naval bombardment and air attacks had damaged some lines. Others were cut accidentally in the confusion. Runners struggled to move along the shattered shoreline under fire. In several sectors, local German commanders were slow to realize just how deep Canadian penetrations were becoming. They assumed that heavy casualties on the beach equated to an overall stalled offensive. They did not fully grasp that Canadian units, bloodied but cohesive, were not only holding the beach, but driving past it with growing momentum. A historian later wrote that Juno showed the victory of flexible, human-centered communication over rigid expectation. That phrase captures something essential about the subgenre we are exploring. Technological innovation in war is never just about machines. It is about how those machines interface with human minds, emotions, and cultures. On Juno, every advance inland was written in both blood and code, in the courage of riflemen and the persistence of signalers who refused to give up on their fragile devices. When we look at the casualty figures, 340 Canadians killed, 574 wounded on D-Day alone, we see numbers, but behind them are thousands of silent dramas, a radio set saved at the cost of a life, a field telephone wire laid down by a man crawling under fire, a final message cut off mid-sentence as a shell found its mark. The deeper Canadian forces pushed inland, the more the nature of their technological challenge shifted. On the beach, the priority had been survival and basic contact. In the hedgerows and villages beyond, complexity increased. Units spread out, lines of sight shortened, and the risk of friendly fire grew. In this landscape, communication technology had to perform a new kind of psychological labor, making sense of a battlefield that felt like a maze. Soldiers sometimes described the inland advance as a series of disjointed vignettes. One moment fighting in a farmhouse, the next lost in a sunken lane lined with tall hedges. Maps helped, but only if they were synchronized with real-time information. Here, every working radio became a kind of anchor to reality. The moral burdens did not lessen. Engineers who had once debated philosophy in mess halls now faced choices like whether to risk exposing an antenna to get a better signal, knowing it could draw mortar fire onto their comrades. Some carried with them small reminders of home, a photograph, a letter, a religious token, tucked into the same pockets as spare fuses and batteries. The mix of the sacred and the technical reflected a broader cultural reality. For many, faith, patriotism, and scientific training were not in conflict, but intertwined. They believed their work was part of a larger, morally necessary effort to defeat tyranny. But belief did not erase trauma. Years later, some would still flinch at the crackle of a radio, their bodies remembering the association between that sound and incoming shells. As the day wore on, Canadian units achieved something that German planners had not budgeted for. They punched inland faster and farther than anticipated, despite the morning's bloodshed. Villages fell, crossroads were seized, and anti-tank positions were neutralized. This did not mean the path ahead would be easy, far from it. German counterattacks, including those by armored units, would challenge the beachhead in the days to come. But the psychological threshold had been crossed. Juno was no longer just a beach, it was a gateway. And the gateway had held. Part of why it held lies in an overlooked truth about wartime technology. Its greatest strength is often revealed in imperfection. If the Canadian communications net had been flawless, it might have been brittle, unable to adapt when reality diverged from plan. Instead, it was flexible, held together as much by human improvisation as by engineering. Its flaws forced its users to become co-creators of its function, turning soldiers into technicians and technicians into problem solvers under fire. In the broader sweep of World War II, Juno Beach sits alongside places like Omaha, Utah, Sword, and Gold in the story of D-Day. But when we zoom in on the human technological dimension, Juno offers a particularly rich case study in humanized innovation. Canada entered the 1930s as a country unsure of its place in the world, with modest military means and strong cultural ties to Britain and France. By 1944, it had become a critical contributor to the largest amphibious operation in history, fielding troops whose effectiveness depended not just on bravery, but on the integration of communications technology shaped by years of anxious trial and error. The engineers and operators who made that possible were not household names. They did not write memoirs that topped bestseller lists. Many went back to quiet civilian lives after the war, their wartime contributions reduced to a line in an official history or a fading photograph in a family album. Yet their work rippled outward in ways they could not have foreseen. After the war, the lessons of Allied communications, including those learned at Juno, fed directly into the development of peacetime technologies. Concepts honed under fire, such as network redundancy, user-friendly interfaces, and training that integrated psychological stressors, influenced emerging fields from civil aviation control to emergency response networks. For Canadian society, The war became a crucible that accelerated modernization. Veterans with technical backgrounds returned home and joined universities, research labs, and industries that would help shape the communications age. They carried with them a hard-won understanding. Technology could save lives, but only if designed and deployed with a deep awareness of human needs, limitations, and emotions. Culturally, Juno also became part of a narrative of national identity. In post-war commemorations, Canadians often emphasized not just the heroism of their soldiers, but the professionalism and competence with which they executed a difficult and bloody assignment. The fact that they advanced so far inland, despite significant casualties, became a point of quiet pride. Over time, documentaries, novels, and museum exhibits began to highlight the behind-the-scenes roles: the signalers, the planners, the engineers. In interviews, some veterans spoke of their radios or field telephones almost as companions, objects that shared their fear and hope, that crackled to life at crucial moments to confirm that they were not alone in hostile territory. This anthropomorphizing of technology reveals how deeply it had embedded itself in their emotional landscapes. Psychologically, surviving Juno left marks that would last a lifetime. For some, the knowledge that their work had enabled an advance, that it had contributed to liberation and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany, brought comfort. They could point to a map, to the line that had been drawn inland through fire and blood, and say, "We helped make that possible." For others, the memories were darker. Every successful transmission also meant that artillery found its target. Every coordinated attack meant someone on the receiving end suffered. This duality is at the heart of wartime innovation. The very tools that protect and empower one side inevitably harm the other. In interviews decades later, a few aging signalers admitted that they sometimes dreamed of faceless voices in German, cut off mid-sentence by blasts they had helped call in. The human mind struggles to hold both the pride of survival and the grief of destruction in the same space. On a global level, World War II communications research accelerated trends that would reshape the modern world. The war pushed forward the miniaturization of components, the robustness of equipment under harsh conditions, and the integration of human factors into design. These advancements fed into early computers, long-distance telephone networks, and eventually the Internet. The idea that a distributed network, resilient to local disruptions, could still function echoed the ad hoc nets on beaches like Juno. Decades later, when engineers designed networks to withstand disasters or attacks, some drew consciously or unconsciously on this lineage. The understanding that flexibility and human-centered design can make a system stronger than sheer raw power. At the same time, notions of psychological warfare and information control, honed during the conflict, did not vanish. Propaganda techniques, censorship strategies, and the use of broadcast media to shape morale all found peacetime analogues in politics and advertising. Some veterans and scholars looked back uneasily, wondering whether the line between necessary wartime mobilization and manipulation had always been as clear as wartime rhetoric suggested. In this sense, Juno's legacy and the war's broader communications legacy remains ethically complex. The same insights that helped maintain morale among frightened young men under fire could be repurposed to sell products or narratives in peacetime, sometimes with little regard for the subtle psychological pressures involved. For Canada specifically, the memory of Juno became a touchstone in education and public remembrance. School trips to museums and beaches, interviews with veterans recorded by institutions, and televised ceremonies created a multi-generational dialogue. Young people learned not only about numbers, 340 killed, 574 wounded on that first day, but about individual stories. The radio operator who refused to abandon his set, the lineman who repaired a severed cable 3 times under sniper fire, the junior officer who calmed his platoon by relaying steady, measured updates from a distant headquarters that never lost faith in their ability to push forward. These stories turned abstract history into human experience, showing how technology and courage intertwined in the crucible of war. And what of our fictional engineer, David? In many ways, he stands in for thousands of real people whose names we do not know. After the war, perhaps he returned to a quiet town, married, raised children, and worked in a factory or a telephone exchange. Maybe he taught electronics at a school or tinkered with early televisions in his basement. Occasionally, on a stormy night when radio static crackled through the speakers, he might have felt a familiar chill, an echo of that day on Juno when the surf was cold and the air was full of steel. If asked about the war, he might have said little, downplaying his role, as many veterans did. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he would know that in the moment when history asked him to choose between fear and duty, between diving for cover and finishing a connection, he had done what he could to keep the fragile web of communication alive. The legacy of Juno, seen through this lens of humanized innovation, invites us to rethink what we mean when we talk about war technology. It is easy to focus on the spectacular, tanks, planes, massive guns. Harder, but perhaps more revealing, is to look at the humble, fallible systems that actually knit an army together. Radios that short out in salt water, telephones that ring in foxholes, hand-drawn diagrams that turn a chaotic shoreline into a map of possibilities. On June 6, 1944, German commanders did not foresee that these modest tools in Canadian hands would withstand the storm long enough to enable a breakthrough, yet they did. The cost was terrible, 340 Canadian dead and 574 wounded on Juno that day alone. But the breakthrough still happened, carried on waves of human voices transmitted over fragile circuits. In the end, that may be the most profound technological lesson of all. No matter how advanced our machines become, their deepest power lies in their ability to carry our intentions, our fears, and our hopes across the gulfs that separate us. So as you picture that young engineer standing in the freezing surf, clutching his radio like a lifeline, while bullets whip the water around him, ask yourself, what really turned the tide that day? Was it the metal and the wiring, or the decision, deep in his mind and in the minds of those around him, to keep going, to adapt, to treat flawed tools as extensions of human will rather than excuses for failure? And now, decades later, as we live in a world built on networks and signals that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944, what responsibilities do we carry when we design and use our own technologies of connection? If stories like Juno teach us anything, it is that behind every signal there is a person, and behind every breakthrough there is a choice. Did your family or your country carry its own stories of World War II technology, quiet acts of innovation and courage that shaped your present in ways you might not have noticed until now? And if so, how will you remember them, and what kind of future will you choose to build with the tools now in your hands? The reality of what Canadian forces faced on Juno that morning was more brutal than any simulation could prepare them for. The tide was higher than expected, covering many of the beach obstacles and turning them into invisible threats that tore into the hulls of landing craft before soldiers could even reach shore. Waves smashed men against steel barriers topped with mines, and the cold channel water, heavy with equipment, became a trap for those who stumbled. The German 716th Infantry Division, though considered a static defense unit with many non-German conscripts, had spent months preparing interlocking fields of fire from concrete bunkers, and their machine guns swept the waterline with methodical, deadly precision. Within the first minutes, entire sections were cut down before they could find cover. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles, touching down at 07:49 hours, saw one landing craft report 6 men killed within seconds of the ramp dropping. B Company of the Queen's Own Rifles came ashore 200 yards east of their intended position, directly in front of the main German resistance nests, and the first LCA to touch down saw 10 of its first 11 soldiers either killed or wounded in the initial burst of fire. For the men carrying communications equipment, radios, field telephones, spare batteries, wire spools, the weight that was supposed to enable coordination now threatened to drag them under the surf. Some made agonizing split-second decisions, abandoning gear to save themselves or comrades, knowing that every piece of equipment lost was a potential gap in the net that hundreds depended on. Others clung to their loads with stubborn determination, crawling through surf and sand under fire, driven by a conviction drilled into them through months of training. Without communication, the assault would disintegrate into isolated pockets, each fighting blind, each unable to call for the naval gunfire or air support that might mean the difference between survival and annihilation. The psychological burden in those moments was almost unbearable. Imagine being 22 years old, trained as a signals operator, watching men you shared breakfast with that morning fall around you, and knowing that your duty is not to stop and help, but to keep moving, to get your equipment functional, to become a node in a network that does not yet exist, but must be willed into being through sheer human persistence under the worst conditions imaginable. The contradiction between the instinct to protect the wounded and the mission to enable the larger effort created a kind of moral whiplash that some veterans would struggle with for the rest of their lives, questioning in quiet moments, decades later, whether they made the right choices in those first chaotic minutes on Juno. As Canadian infantry pushed off the beach and into the villages of Courseulles-sur-Mer, Bernières-sur-Mer and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, the nature of the fighting shifted from a desperate scramble for survival to brutal house-to-house combat. German defenders, dug into stone buildings and fortified positions, resisted fiercely. Snipers picked off officers and radio operators, recognizing the antennas and equipment as high-value targets. Every street corner became a deadly puzzle, where visibility was limited, and the risk of friendly fire grew as units from different companies converged from multiple directions. In this environment, the communications technology that had seemed fragile on the beach now had to prove its worth in a new way, maintaining coherence in three-dimensional urban chaos. Field telephones required lines strung through rubble and across streets swept by machine gun fire, and linemen became some of the most exposed and courageous figures of the advance, repeatedly repairing breaks caused by shell fire or deliberate German sabotage. Radio operators, meanwhile, struggled with interference from nearby friendly transmitters and the physical obstacles of stone walls that blocked or distorted signals. Some improvised by moving to upper floors of captured buildings or setting up temporary relay points, accepting the risk of exposure in exchange for better line of sight for their antennas. The ingenuity was constant and unrehearsed, a kind of desperate jazz where every musician had to improvise around the failures of their instruments and the chaos of the venue. By early afternoon, something remarkable began to emerge from the chaos. Canadian units were not only holding their ground, but pushing inland at a pace that surprised both Allied command and German defenders. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, despite the morning's heavy casualties, was advancing further from the beach than any other Allied force on D-Day. The Regina Rifles and Royal Winnipeg Rifles drove toward Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse and Puteaux-en-Bessin, engaging German infantry in fierce firefights, while other units linked up with British forces from Gold Beach on the right flank, creating a unified Allied front. This advance was not the result of a single brilliant tactical decision or a piece of game-changing technology, but rather the cumulative effect of hundreds of small acts of courage and adaptation. A sergeant finding a way to patch together 2 damaged radios into one working unit, a runner sprinting across open ground when electronic communication failed, a forward observer adjusting artillery fire through a crackling headset while mortar rounds exploded nearby, a junior officer calming panicked troops by relaying steady updates from headquarters that never wavered in their confidence that the push inland would succeed. The human element was everywhere, compensating for technical limitations, turning flawed tools into effective instruments through sheer determination and a culture that valued problem-solving under pressure. German commanders, observing the situation from their command posts, struggled to grasp the full scope of what was happening. Their intelligence assessments had recognized Canadian forces as competent but not exceptional, and their defensive doctrine assumed that even if the Allies gained a foothold on the beach, the inland advance would slow and stall, allowing time for armored counterattacks to crush the beachhead before it could be reinforced. What they had not accounted for was the speed and depth of the Canadian penetration. By nightfall on June 6th, Canadian forces had established positions approximately 10 kilometers inland, further than any other Allied force that day, and had linked up with British units to create a continuous front along a significant portion of the invasion sector. The fact that this was achieved despite 340 Canadians killed, 574 wounded, and 47 captured on that single day speaks to a kind of collective resilience that transcends individual heroism. It was not that Canadian soldiers were superhuman or that their equipment was flawless. It was that their training, culture, and the integration of human factors into their technological systems created a formation capable of absorbing tremendous losses and continuing to function, adapt, and advance. In the days that followed, the fragile gains of D-Day were tested by German counterattacks, including those by elite units like the 12th SS Panzer Division under Kurt Meyer, which struck at 1700 hours on June 7th, forcing the 9th Brigade to withdraw temporarily and inflicting more casualties than the unit had suffered on Juno itself. These counterattacks revealed the vulnerability of the Allied beachhead and the ongoing challenge of maintaining communication and coordination as units spread out over a wider area. The initial communications network, cobbled together under fire on June 6th, now had to expand and adapt to a fluid battlefield, where front lines shifted daily, supply routes were contested, and the fog of war was thick with uncertainty. Engineers and signals personnel worked around the clock to lay new lines, establish relay stations, and troubleshoot equipment that had been pushed beyond its designed limits. The psychological toll was cumulative: sleep deprivation, the constant noise of artillery, the fear of sudden attack, and the grief of losing comrades all wore down even the most resilient individuals. Some began to show signs of what was then called battle fatigue or shell shock, conditions that would later be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, and the strain affected not just frontline soldiers, but also the support personnel whose invisible labor kept the networks running. Yet the network held, bending but not breaking, and as the Allied beachhead consolidated and expanded, the early improvisations of Juno became part of a larger operational system that would eventually carry the Allies across France and into Germany. The legacy of Juno Beach and the technological innovations forged in its fires extended far beyond the battlefield. In the months and years after the war, as veterans returned home and demobilization reshaped societies, the lessons learned in combat communication began to filter into civilian applications. Canadian scientists and engineers who had worked on radar, radio jamming, and signals intelligence during the war found themselves in high demand. The National Research Council of Canada, which had played a critical role in developing military technologies such as radar sets, sonar systems, and the Plan Position Indicator, a radar display innovation still in use today, transitioned much of its work back to civilian purposes, but the intellectual and technical infrastructure built during the war remained. Ionospheric sounding stations, originally installed to predict optimal frequencies for long-distance military communications and to track enemy submarines, led directly to post-war developments in satellite technology, including Canada's Alouette satellite, an early entry into space-age communications. The electronic components, circuit designs, and user interface concepts refined under wartime pressure influenced everything from early computers to the telecommunications networks that would eventually underpin the modern internet. In a very real sense, when we use GPS navigation, make a cell phone call, or send an email, we are beneficiaries of innovations whose lineage traces back through decades to the desperate improvisations of engineers on beaches like Juno, where the failure of a connection could mean the death of comrades and the success of a fragile radio link could enable a breakthrough that changed the course of history. The cultural and psychological impacts of Juno also rippled outward in ways that shaped Canadian national identity. For a country that had often defined itself in relation to Britain and struggled to assert its own distinct character on the world stage, the achievements of Canadian forces in Normandy became a touchstone of pride and self-definition. The fact that Canadian troops on Juno advanced further inland than any other Allied force on D-Day, despite facing fierce resistance and sustaining heavy casualties, became a narrative of competence, courage, and quiet professionalism that resonated with Canadian self-perception. In schools, museums, and annual commemorations, the story of Juno was told and retold, not as triumphalism, but as a somber reminder of the cost of freedom and the values worth fighting for: democracy, resilience, duty, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of liberation and justice. The Juno Beach Centre, established in Normandy as a living memorial, stands as a permanent testament to the 14,000 Canadian volunteers who stormed the beach, the 340 who died there on the first day, and the more than 5,500 who became casualties during the broader Normandy campaign. Visitors to the center walk through exhibits that personalize the statistics, displaying letters, photographs, and artifacts that transform abstract numbers into human stories. Sons, brothers, fathers, friends, and neighbors who had dreams and hopes that ended too soon. The names inscribed on tribute markers made of Canadian maple remind each generation that these sacrifices were not abstract gestures, but deep personal losses that resonate in every corner of national memory. For many Canadians, a pilgrimage to Juno Beach is an emotional and almost spiritual experience, a moment to connect with a past that feels both distant and intimately present, and to reflect on what it means to inherit a legacy built on such profound sacrifice. For the veterans themselves, the return to normalcy after the war was often far more complicated than the heroic narrative suggested. Many struggled with what we now recognize as PTSD, though in the 1940s and 1950s, the understanding and treatment of psychological trauma were limited and often stigmatized. Men who had functioned with remarkable composure under fire sometimes found themselves undone by the mundane stresses of civilian life, haunted by memories that intruded at unexpected moments. The sound of a radio crackling to life, the sight of a beach at low tide, the smell of diesel fuel, or a sudden loud noise that triggered a visceral flashback to incoming artillery. Some withdrew into silence, reluctant to burden their families or communities with stories that seemed too dark or too painful to share. Others found solace in veterans' organizations, where they could speak with men who understood without need for explanation, who had been there and who carried their own invisible scars. The culture of stoicism that had served them well in combat sometimes became a barrier to healing in peacetime, as the expectation to simply move on clashed with the reality that trauma does not vanish on command. Over time, as psychiatry and psychology advanced, and society became more open to discussing mental health, some veterans were able to access support and find ways to integrate their experiences into narratives that honored both the pain and the purpose of what they had endured. Yet for many, the deepest wounds remained private, carried in silence until the end of their lives, a hidden cost of the breakthrough that still happened despite everything. The technological legacy also carried ethical complexities that became more apparent in hindsight. The same innovations in communication and coordination that had helped save lives and win battles could be and were adapted for purposes that raised moral questions. Propaganda techniques, information control, and psychological operations honed during the war found peacetime applications in advertising, political campaigns, and intelligence operations during the Cold War. The Canadian Special Wireless Units, which had provided signals intelligence and intercepted German communications during the war, evolved into permanent institutions for cryptography and electronic surveillance, contributing to the global intelligence networks that defined the second half of the 20th century. Some of the scientists and engineers who had worked on these systems during the war later expressed ambivalence about the trajectory of their work, recognizing that the same tools designed to defeat fascism could, in different hands, be used to undermine privacy, manipulate populations, or enable authoritarian control. This tension between the genuine good that technology can do when deployed with ethical intention and the potential for misuse when values erode remains relevant today as we grapple with issues of data privacy, algorithmic bias, and the militarization of artificial intelligence. The story of Juno Beach and the communications networks that enabled its breakthrough offers a historical lens through which to examine these ongoing dilemmas, reminding us that technology is never neutral and that the human choices embedded in its design, deployment, and governance ultimately determine whether it serves liberation or oppression. In the broader sweep of World War II history, Juno Beach is sometimes overshadowed by more heavily publicized events like Omaha Beach or the Battle of the Bulge. But for those who study the intersection of technology, psychology, and culture in wartime, Juno offers a uniquely rich case study. It was a place where imperfect tools met extraordinary human determination, where cultural values of modesty and professionalism translated into operational effectiveness, and where the invisible labor of communication networks proved as critical as the visible heroics of frontline combat. The fact that German commanders never anticipated that Juno would cost Canada $340 killed and 574 wounded, and still result in the deepest penetration inland of any Allied force on D-Day, speaks to a fundamental misunderstanding of what made the Canadian effort so formidable. It was not superior technology or overwhelming firepower. It was the integration of human factors, training, culture, psychological resilience, and the willingness to adapt under pressure, with technology that, while flawed, was designed and deployed with an understanding that machines are only as good as the people using them and the systems supporting them. This human-centered approach to innovation, born out of necessity and refined through bitter experience, became one of Canada's most important but least celebrated contributions to the Allied victory. As we reflect on these events more than 8 decades later, it is worth asking what Juno Beach can teach us about the relationship between technology and humanity in our own time. We live in an era of rapid technological change, where artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and global communication networks are reshaping every aspect of life. The temptation is often to focus on the capabilities of the technology itself, what it can do, how fast it is, how efficiently it processes information, while giving less attention to the human and ethical dimensions. Who designs it? Whose values are embedded in its algorithms? How it affects the psychological well-being of its users, and what cultural assumptions underpin its deployment. The story of Juno reminds us that even the most sophisticated technology is ultimately an extension of human intention, and that its success or failure depends not just on engineering prowess, but on the wisdom, courage, and ethical commitment of the people behind it. The engineers, soldiers, and support personnel who made the breakthrough at Juno possible were not perfect, and neither were their tools, but they were bound together by a shared sense of purpose and a deep awareness that their work mattered not in the abstract, but in the immediate life-or-death decisions unfolding every minute on a contested beach in France. That awareness shaped how they approached problems, how they improvised solutions, and how they bore the psychological weight of their responsibilities. And it is an awareness we would do well to cultivate as we navigate our own technological frontiers. If we want our innovations to serve humanity rather than diminish it, we need to remember the lessons of Juno, that technology without empathy is brittle, that efficiency without ethics is dangerous, and that the most powerful networks are not those with the fastest processors or the widest bandwidth, but those that connect human beings in ways that honor their dignity, support their resilience, and enable them to act with courage and compassion even in the darkest circumstances. So as you think about the young Canadian engineer standing in the cold surf of Juno Beach, clutching a waterproof satchel with trembling hands, ask yourself what drives innovation in your own life and in the institutions you are part of. Is it the pursuit of capability for its own sake, or is it guided by a vision of what technology should serve and whom it should protect? When systems fail, as they inevitably will, do we abandon them, or do we adapt, improvise, and persist, treating failure as information rather than defeat? And when we succeed, do we reflect on the costs, the sacrifices made, the ethical compromises accepted, the voices marginalized, or do we rush forward without pausing to learn the deeper lessons that only come from honest reckoning with both the triumphs and the traumas of our endeavors? The story of Juno Beach does not offer easy answers to these questions, but it does offer something perhaps more valuable, a vivid, human-scale example of what it looks like to face impossible odds with flawed tools, and still find a way forward through courage, ingenuity, and an unwavering commitment to something larger than oneself. That legacy is not the property of one nation or one generation. It belongs to anyone willing to grapple with the hard, messy, beautiful work of making technology serve human flourishing rather than human destruction. And in a world where the challenges we face, climate change, pandemics, inequality, the erosion of democratic norms, often feel as overwhelming as the Atlantic Wall must have felt to those soldiers waiting in the landing craft. That legacy might be exactly what we need. Not a guarantee of success, but a reminder that breakthroughs are possible even when the costs are high, even when the tools are imperfect, even when the outcome is uncertain, right up until the moment when courage tips the balance, and the impossible becomes real. Now I want to hear from you, because history is not just something that happened to other people in distant times. It is a living conversation across generations, and your voice matters. Did your family have a connection to World War II, to D-Day, to the Canadian forces, or to any of the Allied nations that fought in Normandy? Maybe you have a grandparent or great-grandparent who served, or who worked in factories building the radios and equipment that made operations like Juno possible, or who lived through the war as a civilian and carried memories of fear, hope, and resilience that shaped your family's story. Share those memories in the comments below, because every story adds texture and depth to our understanding of what these events meant and continue to mean. And even if your family's history is not directly connected to Juno Beach, I want to know what you think about the relationship between technology and humanity that we have explored here. Do you see parallels in your own life or work, places where imperfect tools require human ingenuity to become effective, or where ethical questions lurk beneath the surface of technological progress? How do we honor the legacy of those who came before us, while also critically examining the systems and assumptions they built, so that we can carry forward what was noble and necessary while leaving behind what was harmful or unjust? These are not rhetorical questions, they are genuine invitations to think together about how the past informs the present and shapes the future. If this video moved you, challenged you, or taught you something new, please take a moment to hit the like button, because it helps the algorithm share this story with more people who might benefit from hearing it. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more deep dives into the human and technological dimensions of history, because there are so many stories like this that deserve to be told, stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things with flawed tools and uncertain outcomes, stories that remind us that history is not made by distant heroes, but by people like you and me, faced with choices and doing the best we can with what we have. And make sure to click the bell icon so you get notified when the next video drops, because we are going to continue exploring these themes, looking at other innovations and other battles where the intersection of psychology, culture, and technology reveals truths that pure military history or pure technological history alone cannot capture. In the next video, we will be diving into another overlooked story of World War II innovation, one where an engineer's rejected prototype turned out to have implications that rippled far beyond the battlefield and into the fabric of post-war society, shaping family structures, cultural bonds, and the very idea of what mobility and freedom could mean in a world rebuilding from devastation. You are not going to want to miss it, because it connects directly to the themes we have explored here: how human needs drive technological development, how failure can become the seed of unexpected success, and how the moral weight of innovation demands that we look beyond efficiency and capability to ask deeper questions about purpose, cost, and legacy. Thank you for watching, for engaging, and for caring enough about these stories to spend your time here. The veterans of Juno Beach, and all those who contributed to the outcome of that day, did not fight so that we would forget them or reduce their sacrifices to abstract statistics. They fought so that future generations, including ours, could live in freedom and have the opportunity to build a world more just, more compassionate, and more thoughtful than the one they inherited. The least we can do is remember them fully, not just as names on a memorial, but as complex, flawed, courageous human beings whose choices in moments of extremity expanded the boundaries of what was possible and whose legacy challenges us to be worthy stewards of the world they helped to create. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep seeking the human stories behind the headlines, and keep believing that even when the odds seem impossible and the tools are imperfect, breakthroughs can still happen if we have the courage to persist and the wisdom to adapt. See you in the next video.